I can press the start button, and then I'm basically executing all of those lines of code. And then obviously to get out of this, like I said, you can just like type a space and type enter, or you can really type anything and just hit enter, and then the program will terminate. This is sort of our first C# instruction. And like I said, console.writeLine basically just writes a line of text out onto the screen. And then we can include this console.readLine instruction in order to keep that window up so we can see what we're printing out. Now that we know how to print out something onto the screen, I want to show you guys how we can draw a little shape. So I'm actually going to get rid of this, and I'm going to go ahead and copy this WriteLine piece of code, and I'm going to paste it a few times down here. So we're actually going to use this line of code to draw out a shape onto the screen. So down here, I'm going to create like a /, and then up here we'll create one, and I'm going to keep creating them in this little pyramid structure. So now you can see I have like a little pyramid, and then I'm going to make vertical bars going all the way down. So essentially we're drawing out like a little right triangle. And actually, you know, I'm going to put underscores here so it's a little more obvious. So you can see I'm saying console.writeLine, and in each one of these instructions, I'm telling the computer to write out a different line. So over here, we're writing out like the tip of the triangle. Over here, we're writing out the middle part of the triangle, and then the base of the triangle. So now let's go ahead and run this program, and you'll see over here, we're actually able to print out this entire triangle. So just by using that one instruction, that console.writeLine instruction, I was actually able to draw out an entire shape onto the screen. So now I'm going to go ahead and exit off of this. And you'll see down here how easy it was for us to write this program. Now, essentially what happens is when I click that start button, C# is going to go into my program. It's going to find this block of code right here, main. It's going to go inside of these curly brackets, and it's going to execute each instruction, in other words, each line of code, one after the other. So it's going to start with this first line of code, and it's basically going to say, okay, what does the user want me to do? They want me to write a line out onto the console, and they want me to write this text. So it's going to go ahead and write that out onto the console. Then when it's done with this instruction, it's going to come down here and go to this second instruction. It's going to do the same thing. It'll execute that instruction, and then it'll go down here, execute this one, and execute this one. So essentially what C# does is it executes all of the lines of code, all of the instructions that we give it in order. And one of the things you're going to learn is that when we're programming, the order matters. So the order in which you write these lines of code actually matters a lot. So if I was to take this instruction over here and I was to paste it up here in the top, now this is going to change the way that the shape looks. So instead of having that normal triangle, you can see we have this kind of like funky looking shape where the base is up at the top. And that's because we changed the order of the program. Now, essentially, all a program is just a set of instructions specified in a particular order. That's it. And as we go through this course and as you learn more about C#, you're going to find more and more complex instructions that you can use. So the more complex instructions you're able to give the computer and the better you're able to organize them and order them, the more powerful your programs are going to become. So obviously, we only really know two instructions. We know this console.writeLine, which prints something out, and console.readLine, which basically pauses the screen until we enter something. But just with these two lines of code, we were actually able to draw out an entire shape onto the screen, and that was pretty cool. The takeaways from this tutorial is that a program is essentially just a set of instructions that the computer is going to follow. The order of those instructions matter, and in C#, the instructions that are going to get executed by the computer are going to be inside of these open and closed curly brackets in this main block of code. And that's sort of the bare basics of writing a C# program. You know, we were able to print something out onto the screen. We were able to pause that little console until we told it we were done. And now we can kind of go forward and start learning more and more complex instructions and more complex ways to build our programs. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about variables in C#. Now, a lot of times when we're writing programs in C#, we're going to be dealing with a bunch of different data. So there's going to be all sorts of information, all sorts of data values in our programs. And a lot of times that information, those data values, can be kind of hard to keep track of and manage. So in C#, we have a special container called a variable. And a variable is basically just a container where we can store some of that information. So I could store a piece of data or a piece of information that I want to keep track of and manage in my programs inside of a variable. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys what variables are, why they're useful, and we'll look at kind of how we can work with them in our C# programs. So down here, I have written out this very basic program. It's basically just writing out a bunch of lines of text. It says, there once was a man named George. He was 70 years old. He really liked the name George, but didn't like being 70. So this is basically just a program that I wrote which prints out a little story onto the screen. So if I was to run this program, you'll see that we get this story. It says there once was a man named George, he was 70, etc. So I'm able to print out this story onto the screen. So this is a perfectly functional program. We've actually written a program which prints out a story, right? But let's say that I'm looking at my story and I'm thinking to myself, I think I want to change the character's name. Well, let's say instead of having the character be named George, I want to change his name to John. Well, I can just come up here, I can search through my story and find every place where I'm mentioning the character's name, and I can change it to John. Cool, so now my story is updated. I went through, I manually changed the name to John, and everything works. But let's say I'm looking at it again and I'm thinking, maybe I want to try to appeal to a younger audience. So instead of having the character be 70, why don't we have the character be like 35? So once again, I can just go through, I can look through, and every time they mention the character's age, I can just change it to 35. Here's the next one. Cool. So I basically went through and I found out every place where the character's name was mentioned, and I changed it to 35. Here's the problem though. In order to make those changes, in order to modify the character's name and the character's age, I had to go through and manually change it at every place inside of my program. So every place where the character's name was mentioned and the character's age was mentioned, I had to go in and manually change it. Now, this is fine with a story that only has 4 lines, but imagine if this story had hundreds of lines and the character's name was mentioned like 100 times, or their age was mentioned 100 times. Imagine then if you wanted to change the character's name, or imagine even if you just wanted to keep track of and manage the character's name, and it would be extremely difficult. So the more lines in this story that I write, the harder it becomes for me to manage the character's name and the character's age. And these are 2 good examples of pieces of information in our program. In order to make a situation like this a lot easier, we actually have something in C# called a variable. And a variable is basically just a container where I can store a specific data value. And then when I want to use that data value, instead of having to actually like type it out and type out what it is, I can just refer to the variable's name. So I'm going to show you guys how we can create variables and how we can keep track of and manage the different data in our programs, like the character's name and the character's age. So up here above my story, I'm actually going to start creating a variable. And the way that we can create a variable is by giving C# some information. So this is going to be a line of code, and the first piece of information that I want to give to C# is going to be the type of data that I want the variable to be able to store. So remember, variables are just containers that we can store values inside of. And different containers can store different types of information. Some containers can store text, others can store numbers, others can store like other values like true or false values. We're going to go ahead and create a variable that's going to store the character's name. So I want to create a variable that can store text, because the character's name is text. And we can do that by creating a string. So a string is essentially just like a string of characters, and it's basically just plain text. So I'm going to go ahead and tell C# that I want to create a string variable. So I'm just going to type out string. And then what I need to do is give this variable a name. So remember, these are containers. And generally, when we're naming a variable, we want to name it according to what's going to be stored inside of it. That way we can identify what's in the variable. I'm just going to call this character name. And you'll notice here that I'm separating these words so the second word has a capital letter. All right, so I created my variable, and it's going to store a string, which is just plain text. And then I'm going to set it equal to something. So I'm going to say character name is equal to, and now I'm going to give this a value. So I'm going to give this a value that's plain text. I'm going to make an open and closed quotation mark. And then whenever I write a line of code, I always want to end it off with a semicolon, just like that. All right, now inside of these quotation marks, I can write out the string of characters or the string of text that I want to store inside of the character name variable. So we're just going to store the character's name, which is John. So I can just type out John up there. In addition to creating a variable to store the character's name, I also want to create another variable to store the character's age. So let's go ahead and do that. Now the character's age is actually going to be a number, right? So the character's age is a number. It's not really plain text like this. And if we want to create a variable to store a number, we can create a variable called an integer variable. So int stands for integer. And an integer is basically just a whole number. So a number that doesn't have decimal points. And I'm just going to go ahead and name this character age. So again, giving it a name. And I want to show you guys another way that we can create these variables. So in addition to saying like string character name is equal to John, I could also just say int character age. I could put a semicolon here, and then I could come down here and give this a value. So I could say like character age is equal to, and now we can give this a value. So we said 35. And you'll notice that when I give this a number value, I don't need these quotation marks. You only need the quotation marks with a string. So these are two different ways that I can create a variable, and they're doing exactly the same thing. Up here, I'm just saying string character name, and I'm giving it a value right away. Over here, I'm doing what's called declaring the variable. I'm basically saying that we're going to have a variable called character age. I'm not giving it a value right away. And then down here, I'm assigning it a value of 35. So these two, this guy and this guy up here, are doing exactly the same thing. So now that we have these variables, in other words, now that we have containers where we can store the different values or the different pieces of data that we're going to work with in our programs, I want to actually use those variables inside of our story. So I'm going to show you guys how, in addition to printing out this plain text, I can actually print out the value that's stored inside of the variable. So over here, you'll notice that I'm typing out there once was a man named John. But I don't want to have to type out John anymore. I just want to be able to refer to that variable. So what I can do is I can actually get rid of this, and I'm going to come outside of these quotation marks, and over here I'm going to put a plus sign. And this plus sign basically means I want to like append some text, or I want to append a value onto the end of this text over here. And what I want to do is just put the name of the variable. So I'm just going to type out character name. And what this is going to do is it's going to print out there once was a man named, and then a space, and then it's going to print out the value that's stored inside of the character name variable. So it's going to print out John. So let me demonstrate that. Let's go ahead and run this program. And you'll see over here, we're still printing out there once was a man named John, except I didn't have to physically type out John down here. All I did was use this plus sign and essentially just append on, or people will call this concatenate on, the value that was stored inside the character name variable. And this is extremely useful. So I could do the same thing down here with this other occurrence of the character's name. I can just say character name. And now over here, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to say he really liked the name, and then whatever the value that's stored inside of this character name variable. We can do the same thing for the age. So over here, you'll notice that I have the age is 35. But remember, we created this variable up here to store that. So what I can do is I can actually get rid of this, and I'm actually going to make two open and close quotation marks here, and I'm going to make two plus signs, and then in between here, I'm going to type out character age. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm telling this right line instruction that I want to print out he was with a space, and then I want to add in the value that's stored inside of the character age variable, which is going to be 35. And then I want to add into that years old. So basically what we're doing here is called concatenating a string. I'm saying I want to type this out, plus I want to type the value that's in here, plus I want to print out this stuff over there. And then finally we can do the same thing down here. So I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm just going to type in character age. So I've replaced every occurrence of the character's name and the character's age with these variables. So now let's go ahead and run our program. I'm just going to click this start button, and you'll see over here we're printing out the same exact story as before. It says there once was a man named John. He was 35. He liked the name John, and 35. So I essentially just replaced John and 35 with the variables that are storing them. Now, what's cool about these variables is if I wanted to, for example, modify the character's name or the character's age, I can just modify it up here. So let's say we wanted to change the character's name to Tom, and we wanted to make him like 25. Well, now I only have to modify those two values. I only have to update them in one spot, and it's going to update throughout my entire story. So now the character's name is Tom, and he's 25 throughout the entire story. And the variables just make it a lot easier for us to keep track of and for us to manage those pieces of information. Now, you'll notice that I only created variables for the character's name and for the character's age. And that's because those two pieces of information are occurring multiple times in the story. I didn't create a variable for the word once or for the word man because I just didn't need to. You know what I mean? That's not like a distinct piece of information that we want to keep track of. But the character's name and the character's age are definitely pieces of information that we're going to want to keep track of and store. So that's sort of how we can use variables to make it easier to manage the data in our programs. Now, I want to show you guys another cool thing we can do with this. Let's say that halfway through the story, I wanted the character's name to change. I can actually come down here and halfway through printing out the story, I can modify the value of one of these variables. So I could say character name, and I could just give this another value. So I could say character name is equal to Mike. And again, I need this semicolon at the end here. Don't forget that. Now, halfway through the story, the character's name is actually going to change. So if we run the program, you'll see over here it says Tom, and then down here, the name is Mike. So I was able to update the value that was stored inside of our variable halfway through. And that's another cool thing is these variables, you can give them one value and then later on in the program, you can change that value. So that's really the basics of working with variables. We really learned two things. We learned how to create variables and we learned how to use them inside of like a print statement over here. Now, there's a lot more to learn with this. And actually, in the next tutorial, I'm going to be teaching you guys about the different types of information that we can store inside of variables. So over here, we stored a string of text, and we also stored a whole number, which is called an integer. But there's a few other types of data that we can use and work with. So in the next tutorial, we're going to learn about all of that stuff. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about data types in C#. Now in C#, we're going to be dealing with all different types of data and information. And generally, when you're writing programs, there's going to be all different types of information that you're going to be